Gerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Gerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will
Good morning, and welcome back to the American Culturist, the show where we unapologetically celebrate the greatest civilization the world has ever known, the one built on Enlightenment reason, individual liberty, Christian moral foundations, and the conservative conviction that some cultures are simply superior to others because they value truth, beauty, and human flourishing over fanaticism and submission. Today, we're wading into one of the most politically charged topics in America right now. One where simply asking honest questions can get you labeled a bigot, where doctors have lost their licenses for following the evidence, and where an entire medical and media establishment has decided that your feelings about a biological reality matter more than the biological reality itself. We are, of course, talking about transgenderism, gender dysphoria, and the mainstream lie that's been sold to an entire generation of young people and their families under the banner of compassion. Let me be clear before we go any further, because I know how quickly honest conversation about this topic gets misrepresented. Nothing in this episode is about cruelty. Nothing here is about hatred or mockery or the dehumanization of people who experience genuine psychological distress. People who suffer from gender dysphoria are real human beings deserving of the basic modicum of respect and human decency. That's not a disclaimer I'm adding to protect myself. It's the entire point of this episode. Because the argument I'm making today is that the mainstream approach to this issue isn't compassionate at all. It's a lie masquerading as kindness, and lies dressed up as kindness are among the most destructive forces a civilization can unleash on its most vulnerable people. So let's start with what the science actually says, because that's where every honest conversation about this topic has to begin. Biological sex in humans is binary. It's not a spectrum, it's not a social construct, and it's not a continuum of possibilities. It's binary. Just two sexes, defined by one thing above all others: the type of gametes an organism is designed to produce. Females produce large gametes, which we call eggs. Males produce small gametes, which we call sperm. This definition isn't a political opinion or open to such interpretation. It's the definition used by the Endocrine Society, one of the world's most authoritative bodies on hormonal biology. It's the definition that holds universally across all sexually reproducing species on Earth. And it's the definition that no surgical procedure, no hormonal treatment, and no act of legislative willpower has ever altered in a human being. Ever. Not in a single documented case in the history of medicine. And legislation has no ability to dictate the boundaries of this reality, even if they wanted to. Now, you'll hear the objection. What about intersex conditions? It's the first card a progressive or radical leftist always plays, and it deserves an honest answer. Intersex conditions are real. They're developmental variations that affect a very small percentage of the population, producing atypical chromosomal patterns, hormonal profiles, or anatomical characteristics. They're genuinely complex medical situations that deserve serious, individualized medical attention. But here's what they don't do: they don't create a third sex, they don't disprove the binary, and they don't produce individuals who are capable of producing both types of gametes or switching between them. Intersex conditions are variations within a binary system, the same way color blindness is a variation within a visual system. The existence of color blindness doesn't mean color isn't real, and the existence of intersex conditions doesn't mean the female male binary isn't real either. And here's where the statistics become important, because people love to throw around a number. 1.7% of the population is intersex, they say, which may sound significant enough to challenge the binary. But that figure comes from a single 2000 study by Brown University researcher and Fausto Sterling, and it's been thoroughly dismantled in the peer reviewed literature. That 1.7% figure was only achieved by including conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, and late onset adrenal hyperplasia, conditions that don't produce sexual ambiguity at all. When psychologist and physician Dr. Leonard Sachs applied a precise, clinically rigorous definition in the Journal of Sex Research, restricting intersex to cases where chromosomal sex is genuinely inconsistent with phenotypic sex, or the phenotype can't be classified as male or female, the real figure dropped to approximately 0.018% of the population. That's not 1.7%, that's nearly 100 times smaller. To put that in concrete terms, you're statistically more likely to be struck by lightning in your lifetime than to be born with a genuinely ambiguous biological sex. We don't redesign the entire electric grid because lightning occasionally strikes in unexpected places. And we don't redefine the biological reality of the entire human species based on 0.018% of cases. In statistics, there's a foundational principle that the norm is defined by the central tendency of the data, the median, the mean, and the overwhelming pattern, not by the extreme outliers at the tail ends of the distribution. If 99.982% of human beings are born unambiguously male or female, then binary biological sex isn't a cultural construct or a political opinion. It's the mathematical reality of our species. What's also real is gender dysphoria. And this is where the conversation requires the most care, because conflating the biological reality with the psychological experience is exactly where the mainstream narrative goes wrong. Gender dysphoria is a recognized clinical condition listed in the DSM 5, the American Psychiatric Association's official diagnostic manual. It's defined as the clinically significant distress that arises from a mismatch between a person's experienced gender identity and their biological sex. The American Psychiatric Association is explicit on this point. Gender nonconformity is not itself a mental disorder. The disorder is the distress, and that distress is well documented and deserves genuine clinical attention. But here's what the data also shows, and this is the part that the mainstream narrative desperately doesn't want you to examine. Gender dysphoria rarely arrives alone. A landmark study published in the Journal of Pediatrics, drawing on data from 6 major pediatric health systems through the PedsNet Research Network, found that 61.3% of youth diagnosed with gender dysphoria also carried a separate psychiatric diagnosis in their medical records, compared to 28.2% of matched controls. That's more than double the rate. Major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, ADHD, eating disorders, and autism spectrum conditions all appear in this population at dramatically elevated rates. Studies consistently show that autistic traits or confirmed autism diagnosis are found in somewhere between 11 and 26% of gender dysphoric youths, compared to roughly 1 to 2% in the general population. This data tells us something critically important that the affirmation model simply ignores. For the majority of people experiencing gender dysphoria, the gender distress doesn't exist in isolation. It exists alongside a constellation of other psychological and neurological challenges that aren't being treated when we jump straight to social and medical transition. And the question nobody in the mainstream is willing to ask out loud is this: what if, for many of these young people, the gender dysphoria is a symptom rather than a root cause? What if treating the depression, the anxiety, the autism related struggles with social identity, and the trauma history would resolve or dramatically reduce the gender distress without requiring anyone to put a child on puberty blockers? That's not a fringe question from a right wing commentator. That's the exact question that the most comprehensive review of gender medicine ever conducted arrived at after 4 years of systematic research. In April 2024, the United Kingdom's National Health Service published the final report of the CAS review, a 388-page, 4-year independent investigation into gender identity services for children and young people, led by Dr. Hilary Cass, the former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. This wasn't a culture war document. It wasn't a political statement. It was a rigorous, systematic review of every published study on the clinical outcomes of gender affirming care for minors commissioned by one of the world's most respected national health systems. Its findings were devastating to the affirmation model. Dr. Cass concluded that the evidence base for puberty blockers, the drugs routinely prescribed to gender dysphoric children as young as 10 or 11 to pause the physical changes of puberty, was, in her words, very weak. The systematic review found no credible evidence of psychological benefit from puberty suppression in gender dysphoric youth. It found serious concerns about the impact of these drugs on brain development, bone density, and psychosexual maturation. And it found that nearly 100% of children who were started on puberty blockers went on to cross sex hormones, a progression that the review treated as a deeply troubling signal that the drugs weren't giving children time to think. They were locking them into a medical pathway before they were old enough to understand its lifelong consequences. The NHS's response was immediate and unambiguous. It banned routine prescribing of puberty blockers to minors. It closed the Tavistock Gender Clinic, which had been the primary youth gender service in England, and it replaced the affirmation model with a new standard of care centered on psychosocial support, addressing the mental health and neurodevelopment conditions alongside the gender distress rather than bypassing them with medical intervention. And England wasn't alone. Sweden concluded in 2022 that the risks of puberty blockers and gender affirming hormones likely outweighed the expected benefits, restricting their use to exceptional cases in research settings. Finland declared youth hormonal gender transition to be experimental as early as 2020. Denmark, which was medically transitioning 65% of referred youths as recently as 2018, had dropped that figure to just 6% by 2020, pivoting instead of counseling and psychosocial support as its primary intervention. The European medical establishment, the same countries that pioneered the so called Dutch Protocol for youth gender transitions in the 1990s, has now largely walked it back after systematic reviews of the evidence found that the benefits weren't holding up. While all of this was happening in Europe, the American medical establishment did something remarkable. It doubled down. The American Academy of Pediatrics, in its 2023 annual leadership forum, reaffirmed its full affirmation model, refusing to acknowledge the findings of the European systematic reviews. The prevailing message in American pediatric gender medicine has continued to insist that transition is the only acceptable treatment, that questioning this approach constitutes conversion therapy, and that parents who express hesitation are putting their children at risk of self deletion. That last point deserves particular attention because it's the rhetorical weapon used most aggressively to silence any questioning of the affirmation model. The claim that if you don't affirm your child's gender identity, you're responsible for their self deletion. This is manipulative, and the science doesn't support it as cleanly as it's pretended. Yes, gender dysphoric youths have elevated rates of self deletion ideation, but the Cass review found that the evidence for medical transition reducing risks of self deletion are not strong. And the comorbidity data we discussed earlier tells us that the elevated self deletion risk in this population is almost certainly connected to the broader mental health landscape: the depression, the anxiety, the autism, the trauma, not to the gender dysphoria alone. Treating the gender dysphoria in isolation with irreversible medical interventions while leaving the underlying conditions unaddressed isn't compassion. It's malpractice dressed up as affirmation. The Western philosophical tradition has a word for what's happening here, and it's not a kind one. It's called sophistry, the use of clever sounding arguments to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. Plato spent a significant portion of his philosophical career arguing against the sophists of ancient Athens, who were paid to make weak arguments sound strong and comfortable conclusions sound inevitable. The argument that questioning irreversible medical interventions on children is equivalent to hating those children is sophistry. The argument that biology is a social construct is sophistry. The argument that the most loving thing you could do for a person in psychological distress is to affirm their distress rather than treat its root is sophistry. The Christian tradition is even more direct about it. Truth isn't optional for a civilization that wants to survive. It's not optional for medicine that wants to heal. And it's not optional for care that actually wants to help rather than simply feel good about itself. When we tell a person or a child that they were born in the wrong body, we're not being kind. We're handing them a framework of understanding their distress that forecloses every other avenue of healing before they've even had a chance to explore them. We're telling them that the problem is their body and not anything treatable in the mind, and that the solution is a lifetime of medical intervention to approximate something that biology has made impossible to fully achieve. That's not compassion, that's abdication. Real compassion looks different. It looks like taking the full clinical picture seriously, addressing the depression, the anxiety, the autism related identity struggles, and the trauma, the social factors, before reaching for irreversible interventions. It looks like telling young people the truth about what medicine can and can't do and about the evidence base for the treatment being offered. It looks like the CAS review. It looks like what Sweden and Finland and Denmark did when the evidence stopped supporting their previous approach. It looks like being willing to be uncomfortable and unpopular in the service of the actual well being of the person rather than the emotional comfort or affirmation of the people around them. And it looks like this episode. Not because we have contempt for people who are suffering, but because we have too much respect for them to lie to their faces in the name of kindness. The thinking on this topic is changing. The science is catching up to what honest clinicians have been saying for years, and the civilization that built the very concept of evidence based medicine, the Western civilization that developed the randomized control trial, the systematic review, and the ethical obligation to do no harm, is the civilization best equipped to course correct. But only if it's willing to tell the truth. Anyways, that's it for today. If this episode gave you something worth thinking about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not for the metrics, but because the people caught in the middle of this debate, the young people and their families trying to navigate a genuinely difficult situation, deserve to hear something other than what the mainstream is telling them. If you've stuck with me until the end, thank you. Please like and subscribe if you want more of this conversation, and we'll see you next time. God bless.